the Ukraine to make it back to South Africa because everybody's fleeing the country effectively. Flights are all sold out. To get a flight, you need to walk across the border into Moldova, where you hope to catch a flight somewhere to somewhere into Central Europe, and then find your way to South Africa from there. It's escalating. More aid has been made available for the Ukraine. It seems that Russia is on the back foot, but the problem is ever escalating. What's the nature of that problem? More importantly, is it coming to an end? Did South Africa's opinion in the beginning of the war matter so much that it could have been a sore point in the meeting that Ramaphosa had with Joe Biden? Important conversation. And Anthony van Nieuwkerk, who is a professor at the Thabo Mbeki African School for Public and International Affairs, will be joining us for that conversation. Again, you can be a part of the show. The number to dial is 086 0002032 086 0002007. Again, if you do send us a voice note, Lesotho would like them to be shorter than a minute, and do turn off the radio before you record that voice note. You can tweet me live at Oliver_speaking. Remember, this is a simulcast. The show is being simulcasted across all our digital platforms, so you can watch the show on Twitter, you can watch the show on Facebook, and you can watch the show on our YouTube page, and leave comments and interact on those platforms as well. On the other side of this, we speak to Hilary Joffe.
This Week, Today with Olivier Dickson.
Hilary, thank you so much for your time this evening. Once again, really appreciate it. You've got an extensive history writing about Eskom and its crisis. So maybe let's start here. What is the nature of the problem at Eskom? More specifically, is it a political problem? Is it a capacity engineering problem, as Thabo Mbeki would have pointed out this week? Is it a combination of the two, or is it a problem of no vision?
You froze for a minute.
Oh, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. You asked, is it a capacity problem?
Is it a political problem? Is it a capacity / engineering problem? Is it a combination of the two? Or is it simply a problem of no political will and vision?
Oh, I'm sure it's all of those. And I suppose if we knew the answer.
Oh, Hilary, you seem to have frozen there for a minute. It seems like the internet connectivity and load shedding is not holding too well up for us. Can you start that again? Let's see if we have a stabilized line now.
Oliver, I think it is all of the above and combinations and permutations of those. And it has a long history, as you know. I mean, we're coming up to 15 years of load shedding, starting in 2007. I think there have been a lot of policy mistakes. There have been political mistakes. But I do think at this point, what we are looking at is not just a policy problem, which we do have, but also a really deep operational problem at Eskom. And you'll remember the president's emergency plan in July said it was going to focus on, number one, improving the performance of Eskom's existing power stations, and number two, adding as much generation capacity to the grid as possible, as quickly as possible. 2 months later, not only has the performance of Eskom's power stations not improved, but it seems actually to have got worse. Taking into account that those are old power stations, but even an old car, well maintained and properly looked after, should be able to run every now and again.
Yeah. Let's maybe, I appreciate that you're delineating the policy problem away from the operational problem. Let's perhaps start with the second one and we'll move to the policy problem after that. At an operational level, what seems to be going wrong, Hilary? Power stations are tripping, going offline. We're being told maintenance is not being, not enough maintenance is being done on these aged power stations. a lot of weird things happened. The Minister of Public Enterprises wrote to trade unions saying, hey, help us find competent engineers and specialists in this field. So clearly that's an admission that they didn't have the engineering capacity to carry out a lot of the technical work that seems to have been the problem. Where does the operational problem begin? Does it begin at the top in the office of the board and going all the way down into the CEO and spreading across the executive arm of the organization, or is it somewhere along the middle?
I think we have to look at the history. We do have to start there. These are old power. They are not all old power stations. Some of them, like Medupi and Kusile or Ningula, are brand new. But a lot of the coal-fired power stations are old, plus which after 15 years of being very short of power, they've been running them very, very hard. And when you run machines very, very hard, you either have to look after them really, really carefully and do a lot of maintenance, or they're going to give you a lot of trouble. So you've got to see it in that context. And I think that history is important, that, the policy issue is Eskom started to build too late because government wouldn't let it build new power stations. The old power stations have been run very hard for a long time. There have been some phases where very, very little maintenance was done. And so what you've got is power stations, especially the old ones, which are really pretty frail. And some of the new ones, Medupi and Kusile, were built in. There was a lot of corruption. They were built in a hurry. They were poorly designed. They're poorly built. So they don't produce optimally either. And what you get is the other day, I think it was Sunday, you had more than 15,000 megawatts out of action. Not because planned maintenance, but because of basically accidents. Now, that is the equivalent of more than 3.5 Medupis not operating. So you've got a real operational problem here, and that's excluding the need to do maintenance. Now, of course, because there's not enough capacity online, because it keeps tripping out, you don't have you don't have the space to do the maintenance. So that's really what's happening. Now, why that's happening, there is the history, but I think there's also the present. Eskom has lost a lot of competent people, let's say experienced people, over the past 10 years, especially. We had the era of state capture. It drove a lot of the very, very experienced Eskom people away. And we're not just talking engineers. Eskom needs engineers. It needs geologists who understand coal. It needs finance people. State capture drove a lot of them out, but rounds of retrenchment have driven more of them out. And just in case you think it's a racial problem, it's really not. Eskom had been hiring and promoting black executives and engineers from the 1980s. So as many of the experienced people who've left were black as white. I don't know what the breakdown is. So it's not a case of a bunch of white people were pushed out. It's a bunch of, there were really, really experienced black engineers who left as well. So I think, there's still some really, really good people who must be very dedicated, and we should stand with them at Eskom, but there is not the experience there used to be to maintain power stations which are really creaky. So I think that's kind of the beginning of it. Over and above that, we just don't know. There have been mentions of sabotage, and whether or not it's deliberate, morale must be quite low. So, you can imagine there's that factor. There's corruption within the ranks. There are all sorts of quite adverse factors. But I think that we do have a very serious operational problem here. And in a way, the quickest way to stop load shedding is to try and improve the performance of those power stations, because new generation capacity does need to come, but it's going to take time.
Yeah. A lot of people in South Africa seem to want to make the problem, they want to personalize the problem around certain, figures and sort of shift around these blame distribution that they're doing. based on their position about the current political leadership of the country, right? So an example of that would be people saying things like, well, during Brian Molefe and Machele Koko's time, we didn't have this much load shedding. In fact, those guys knew how to run Eskom. Let's bring them back, although we did have load shedding. But the argument that keeps coming up is that they were better at running the institution. They burnt less diesel. They did more maintenance. Andre de Ruyter is not doing any of that. He must be incompetent. Is that a correct way and a fair way of framing the current problem at Eskom's load shedding crisis in the more recent historical context?
I totally agree with you, Oliver. I think we spend so much time blaming instead of solving the problem. The one politician blames the other politician, and we all kind of love to blame our leaders and say they must go. But, if you got rid of Andre de Ruyter now for the sake of argument, then you're going to bring in a chief executive who's going to take a year to get up to speed. Is that going to help us? I mean, I'm sure the people who are there are doing their best. And I'm not replacing the leadership this minute cannot possibly be an immediate answer to the problem. It could make it worse. That they do need to bring in people who can help them, that is no question about that. So I think the blame game is really kind of counterproductive. Certainly Machele Koko, bless him, he loves to put it about that had he been there, he would have done a much better job of this. From what I understand, those guys in part kept the lights on because they did very little maintenance. And of course, if you don't take the power stations out for maintenance, Machele is, he was one of those Eskom engineers who'd been there for a long time. So, he knew a lot about the power stations. Brian Molefe, it did certainly appear in those years that they were doing better. And but why that is not very clear. Some people have suggested that they did very, very little maintenance or massage the figures a little bit. I can't comment on that. But I think at this point, the issue is to solve the problem. Yeah. And I think, saying, and we're certainly not, bringing back people who've been quite disruptive and in their own right is not the answer.
Yeah. Let's move to the first part around policy, and maybe I want to start with governance before we get to policy, right? Because governance is effectively the creation and implementation of said policy. Are the governance structures of Eskom correctly constituted? Do we understand correctly what the board of Eskom needs to be doing, and are they doing what they're truly supposed to be doing from a governance perspective?
I think it's worth taking a step back from there about how state-owned enterprises tend to work in South Africa. Because the shareholder is government and the board is appointed by government. And in a private company, the board is given a mandate by the shareholder, if you like, and they exercise oversight independently over an independent executive. In South Africa, I think the whole structure of governance of our state-owned enterprises is really a mess. I mean, we've got cadre deployment into board and sometimes executive positions instead of appointing people who really are good board members and have the experience and expertise to exercise oversight. We have cadre deployment at the executive level as well. So the whole approach to governance is very problematic, and I think you get extensive political interference in the SOEs. I think that is government's approach, that, Praveen Gordhan he gets involved at quite a granular day-to-day level, which a shareholder in a private company would never get involved at that level. Instead of saying, here is your clear mandate, deliver on it, I'm going to hold you accountable. Everybody wants to get their fingers in the pie. And now we have a dedicated National Energy Crisis Committee, which the president set up in July to try and solve this problem. And that was reporting to an interministerial task team, and then it's reporting into cabinet. And I don't know where the board and the executive fit in, but I wouldn't want to be the chief executive of that company. I mean, who are you accountable to exactly and for what?
Yeah. Are there too many parallel structures? Is that what you're saying?
There are too many parallel structures, a lack of clarity about what we are really trying to achieve. I would say what we're trying to achieve is keeping the lights on for the country. But state-owned enterprises have been traditionally overloaded with all sorts of other objectives. It's the developmental models. So there's that. So there's a lack of clarity about what their mandate is and what we're trying to achieve with the state-owned enterprises. There are all these parallel structures. And there is, in the end, a lack of accountability even of the shareholder minister. Do we hold Praveen Gordhan accountable for Eskom?
Yeah.
For example.
Yeah. 086 000 2032 086 000 2032. Give us a call. That is the number to dial. You can also send us a WhatsApp voice note on 0614 104 107 0614 104 107, and that open line number one last time, 086 000 2032. Hillary, I want to take the conversation now to the policy arm of it, but not to leave the governance conversation behind. I think it matters as much. What is the nature of the Eskom policy crisis, and where did it all begin? I ask this in light of the governance and reporting structure of Eskom. There was an earlier debate this year about whether or not the shareholder in Eskom should be the Department of, or the Minister of Public Enterprises, or it should be the Minister of Energy, Gwede Mantashe. And the argument is if it's under one or the other, that it will impact policy, it will impact governance, and it will impact operations. Let's break all of that apart. What is the nature of the current policy crisis that you think should take the lion's share of blame or the lion's share of analysis as to what's happening at Eskom?
Let me comment on the people, if you like, departmental issue. I think in a way that may be a red herring. The issue is, how do you govern Eskom in a way that makes it clear what its mandate is, puts people on the board who have the expertise and the experience to exercise real oversight. At the moment, we don't really have enough of those. In fact, there are hardly any people on the Eskom board because the state hasn't made appointments. And then, put good management in place who are accountable for performance. So I think we need to look at how do we achieve that and what is the mandate, instead of like having a long debate about where it would sit. That's a subsidiary debate, if you like. But you ask about the policy crisis. And again, there's a history, and Eskom loves still to say, government in the late 90s was actually going to leave it to private generators to build the new power stations that the country needed. Then basically we faffed around for years, and we got neither private nor public. And in the end, in a rather kind of last-minute-y way, in 2007, Eskom starts building. And that, in a way, is why Madupi and Kusile are, what they are. They started building them before they'd even properly designed them.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah. So, and by the time, and then there were endless delays, and the whole process was pretty poor. And so we started running out of power at a pretty rapid rate. And,
seemingly money
we've
too.
Had load shedding till. Oh yeah, their money too. Yeah, that's a whole program on its own. But yeah, so we've had load shedding on and off since late 2007.
Yeah.
So the policy crisis is, it was about were we going to go private or public. I mean, you had to choose one and do it properly. At this point now, the last several years, it's pretty clear that Eskom certainly doesn't have the money to build anything new. It has a lot of debt, not any money. And anyway, it's made such a poor job of it that we wouldn't want it to run any more power stations, is my personal opinion. I mean, even if you kind of really think the state should be in charge, if you look at the performance, you don't want these people to have their hands on any more power stations. Just let them try and fix the existing ones. So it's a money issue and a performance issue, but it's also that the private sector stands ready and is really, really keen to build new power stations. And they are really, really particularly keen to build new solar and wind and other renewable energy power stations, because South Africa is committed to making a transition over time away from coal. So at the moment, we depend on coal for 90% of our electricity. We need to start moving away from that, and we need to start building new power capacity, which is renewable energy. And the private sector is dead keen to do that. In fact, they're keen to do it in the case of the mining companies, for example, and a lot of other companies. They are willing and ready to just build for themselves. They'll build their own power stations for their own use or sell the power to their neighbors. The mining industry has, I think, maybe up to 6,000 megawatts that mining companies want to build. Companies like Amazon are building their own renewable energy. So there, what you want is Eskom owns the grid, the national transmission grid. What you want is everybody to crowd in, build the capacity that they need and South Africa needs, and Eskom remains in charge of the transmission. And then you want to invest in Eskom's transmission grid so that it can transport all this power around the place. And that is really government's policy. But where I think you're asking what's the policy problem? The policy problem really is that there hasn't been enough agreement within government over that. And this is where we get to the sort of, the issue with the Minister Gwede Mantashe, who's not too keen on renewables, and his department is not making it terribly easy. And so that new generation coming onto the grid is really happening very much slower than it should.
Why is there a nervousness about renewable energy from the Department of Energy?
Look, Minister Mantashe was a coal miner. Well, he wasn't actually a miner, but he did work for a coal company. I think there's obviously a concern, and we've had this discussion, I think, before, Oliver.
Yeah.
There's a concern about moving away from coal. There are whole communities in Mpumalanga and elsewhere which were built on coal and depend on coal for their livelihoods. Those old coal-fired power stations that we were talking about that are 40, 50, sometimes 60 years old, they actually do need to close anyway, because at some point a car reaches the end of its useful life and you've got to let it go. So they do have to close, and nobody in the world, given the world's move to, the climate change issues, nobody in the world wants to finance new coal-fired power stations. Everyone in the world wants to finance new renewable energy power stations. So it makes sense for South Africa to put a lot of effort into finding some other means of livelihood for those coal communities over the next 10, 20 years. But at the same time, taking advantage of the appetite by people to build new renewable energy. And it doesn't really matter, one unit of electricity is very much like another. Whether you build it, whether a mine builds it for its own use, or Eskom builds it, or whoever builds it, it's the same electron, and we just need capacity. We need generation.
There's a nervousness generally, and a justified one, Hillary, around the ability of the private sector to be regulated, and specifically price regulated. NERSA seems to be disempowered just with Eskom itself, having lost a crucial court case a year or two ago on tariff hikes, right? And this is why it seems Eskom has been able to bulldoze NERSA every time they wanted a tariff hike, and NERSA doesn't have enough room to push back against that. How much price regulation capacity and ability will NERSA have against the private sector? Because the fear is, if you bring in the profit-seeking private sector that doesn't have a social mandate in the same way a state institution would, that you would price poor people out of electricity, the affordability of electricity. And this perhaps matters given that if mines and large corporations start migrating away from Eskom onto their own supply, that Eskom loses its biggest customers and loses a large share of revenue, and therefore does not become no longer holds a monopoly, and therefore cannot borrow more money to keep funding its build and operations capacity programs. Let's start with NERSA. Is it structurally sound enough to be able to protect poor people?
First, let me say that the regulatory issues are not just about price regulation. They're about licensing and wheeling power over the grid and a whole bunch of other issues, which are actually holding up the renewable energy generators from coming onto the grid much more than the price issues. The price issues are not the holdup at the moment. NERSA is a bit of a hold-up because under the exemptions, the reforms that the president announced, where private sector generators can build their own power, NERSA no longer has to give them a license, but it does have to register them.
Yeah.
And you would think that would just be, you come along with your certificate, you show you've got all the environmental approvals and you can connect to Eskom and whatever, you just register it, boom, it should take like 5 minutes. But NERSA seems to have been making an absolute issue out of this whole process, and it's taking just as long. I think NERSA, but let's go back to pricing for a second. The pricing model, the regulatory model for pricing is broken, and it has been for a long time. It just isn't working for this environment. I'm not the expert on, the regulatory model for Eskom tariffs, which is a very complicated subject, and you've alluded to some of it, cross subsidies from one bit to the other bit, etc. It needs to be redone, and it really does, and it especially needs to be redone for a market in which we've got a lot more private sector generation. Just in case you think that private sector generation is more expensive. Today, I think it was, or maybe it was yesterday, the Minister Mantashe signed, there were 3 new renewable energy producers under the Minister's Renewable Energy Program that he administers. They have come in, they will produce at 60 cents a kilowatt hour. That's what they bid, and that's what he accepted, and they will now be able to start building. And the tariff that Eskom is asking for is more than double that.
Oh, wow.
To cover its costs. Yep. There's absolutely no question. The price of renewable energy has come down. There is absolutely no question that renewable energy is cheaper than the coal-fired power that Eskom is producing.
Okay. 086-000-2032. Give us a call. That is the number to dial. Let's go to Mpumalanga. Anonymous in Mpumalanga. Good evening. Anonymous? Seems that we have lost Anonymous. But we do have some voice notes for you on our WhatsApp voice note line.
Good evening, Abu Oliver. South Africa and Zimbabwe. The Beitbridge border port has got to come to a standstill. Drivers has got to struggle to cross the border post because there is no generators, there is no solar panels. 2 huge countries, 2 huge ruling parties, ZANU-PF and ANC. Leadership has failed. How can that be? KFC has got generators, McDonald's have got generators, all these restaurants have got generators, but the biggest border post, Beitbridge, doesn't have a generator. Aye.
Hello, Oliver. I believe the problem that South Africans are having in as far as the issue of electricity is concerned, it's leadership bankruptcy. I don't think it's political or something else, but our leaders, I think they lack vision, because leaders of vision are able to see the future and now address the problems before they can even arise. So if you find us moving from crisis to crisis, problem to problem, the way we do, it is because we do not have leaders who are capable enough, who are able to address things as they're supposed to. Ralph Mpangane in Mpumalanga Bushbuckridge from Bakucha High School.
Thank you very much for those voice notes, and thank you much for the engagement. Hillary, thank you for your time. Always insightful. I hope wish we could have you for longer. A lot more to discuss and unpack, but really do appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Oliver.
That is Hillary Joffe, editor-at-large for the Business Day, chatting on Eskom. Hillary perhaps has the most extensive career as a journalist writing on Eskom, spanning over, 20 plus years. So she's a well of knowledge on that. Let's take a quick break. On the other side of this, we discuss Ukraine. We discuss South Africa. We discuss Russia and the United States of America, United Nations General Assembly. And how did that meeting with Cyril and Joe Biden go? Was it awkward at all? Do you imagine that it was? On the other side of this, we speak to Professor Anthony van Nieuwkerk.
The Jet Set Breakfast.
I wonder if you're the kind of person who, like, you take your food waste, you put it in a bin, and then you decide that you are going to compost in your own home or in your own garden. Now, what would happen if that was done on a massive scale?
We are accumulating quite a lot of organic waste from our kitchens. We are not eating the onion peels. We are not eating the banana peels. There's quite a lot of food waste, not necessarily the food that we are throwing out, but the byproducts. I'm saying that all that organic waste is not supposed to be going into the dustbin. It has such a high value of nutrients in it, and we can take it back to the soil and be able then to grow food in our small spaces at home.
Michelle Constant on SAFM. Giving you new perspectives and information with deep dive expert analysis of the biggest stories that shaped your world this week.
If you're watching the show live on our Twitter page, on our Facebook page, or on our YouTube page, you would have just seen Lisoko get excited behind my chair over here. That's why you should watch the show, so you can see the behind the scenes of what it takes to put this together. Professor Anthony van Nieuwkerk is with us. Thank you for your time, your engagement. Really, really do appreciate it. Stay safe. Have a fantastic spring weekend. I'm back with you next week. It's a minute after 7 p.m. Time for your news.
Independent and impartial. This is SAFM News.
Thanks, Oliver. The top stories this hour: the NPA declines to prosecute the finance minister, and the drowning victim's family seeks answers. A very good evening. The NPA says it has declined to prosecute the second